Welcome back to Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green. We've covered a lot of ground. We've talked about the presidency, we've gone through Congress, the judiciary, and we've started with the Bill of Rights. In our last section, we covered the First Amendment, and now we're going to cover the 2nd through the 10th. So a lot more ground to gain. These are all of our inalienable rights that we want to protect.
They are, and if you go back to what we said about the fundamental principles from the Declaration that frames the Constitution, you start with there is a God, He gives inalienable rights, government exists to protect those rights, and there is a fixed moral law called the laws of nature, nature's God. At the time that was included in the Declaration, everybody knew where that came from. It came from this set of books right here. This is Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law, introduced about 1766 through 69, 4-volume set. This is what American attorneys studied, because we were still British citizens back then. Thomas Jefferson made the comment that American attorneys study this in the same way that Muslims study the Quran. So they knew this. And it is in volume 1 here, in the 2nd chapter, that Blackstone, and by the way, Blackstone was so significant, the Founding Fathers, of all the potential thousands of books that are out there in government. In the founding era, from 1760 to 1805, he is the 2nd most cited source by the Founding Fathers. So they used it.
Huge impact.
Huge impact. So, and by the way, he's the 2nd most cited human source. The number 1 most cited source was the Bible. 34% of all their quotes went back to the Bible in the founding era. And then you had folks like Baron Charles de Montesquieu, who was the single highest human source, and he's the 2nd highest human source. So these are the guys. But in here, you get that phrase, the laws of nature and nature's God. And as Blackstone points out, that deals with the dual revelation of God, because God revealed Himself in nature, and God also revealed Himself in laws, the laws of nature's God, the God who created nature, and the laws of the God who created nature, and that's the Scriptures.
So that's not just any religion, it's not just a New Age kind of sense of there's a specific revelation.
There's the holy, as he said, in the Holy Scriptures. Yeah. So it is the Bible. But what's interesting in this is they were trained to think in a way we don't think today. And they were a very agrarian society. Even if you lived in Boston, you still had to deal with horses, and you had to deal with animals and livestock, and so you're very agrarian. And you'll find that people who are raised in the country have a different view of the laws of nature than those that are raised in the city. If you've been raised in New York City and you've grown up your whole life, and a lot of folks in New York City have never gone out of a 6-block area square, I've met them, those high rises, they've got doctors and they've got beauty salons and they've got grocery stores.
Their whole life is right there.
Their whole life is right there.
A lot of things that they haven't been exposed to that a person living out in the country.
Literally, we used to take groups of kids out of New York City, out onto Long Island, and let them walk on grass. They'd never done that. There's grass in Central Park, but a lot of these kids have never been there. And then you'd point at a cow, and what's that? Well, that's a cow. Well, that's where you get milk. It is not. That's not where
we get them from that carton.
Exactly. Exactly. And so if you're not...
Now, that's not an exaggeration,
That's not
David.
an exaggeration.
I'm telling you. No, I served on the Ag Committee, and I remember we actually used to have displays at the livestock shows to bring those kids in. I mean, this is today.
That's right.
Teach these kids. That's where the milk actually comes. So if your world is contained in the city, you have never been exposed to those
You've
things.
never been exposed to it, and if you don't have that rural mentality, you miss the laws of nature.
Yeah.
Now, the laws of nature are interesting for a number of reasons. The laws of nature tell you what's right and wrong, so the Founding Fathers said there's the laws of nature and the laws of nature's God. And kind of explaining how this works, I'm a cowboy. Got the ranch, got the horses, got the cattle, all the stuff that goes with it. So I do a lot of trail riding. So horses, you got to have a horse that you absolutely trust. You got to be bonded with your horse, because you get in dangerous situations. So if I tell my horse to go off the side of this cliff and walk that goat trail down the face, you got to be willing to do it, because if it does anything goofy, I'll be the one going down, maybe the horse on top of me. If I tell that horse, got to swim this fast-moving river, I got to get the horse does. So you have to have a good relationship with the horse. Great relationship with the mare. Well, she had a little foal, and when she had that foal, I go into the barn to feed that horse. I'll come out with a footprint in the middle of my forehead because it is kicked into her that I have to defend my young. Wait a minute, that's my barn. I built it for you. Yeah, but she thinks that's her home.
And that's supposed to be the mare that trusts you, right?
And that's
so
right.
What changed?
What changed is the laws of nature. It is natural for animals, for anything created in nature, to defend what it considers to be its home, to defend what it considers to be its young, and to defend its own life. If you come after her with malice, she will fight back. You come after her kids, she will fight back.
That's the mama bear. I mean, you're going to protect those cubs.
And so that's a law of nature. I don't need the Bible, and I don't need any civil parchment to tell me that I've got a right to defend myself. That's a law of nature.
Or your family.
Or family, what I perceive. Same with property ownership. I don't care whether you're a snake or whether you're a rat or a mouse or a raccoon. When you're born, you find something you consider to be your home, and you live there, and you will defend that. You have a right to that property around there. Now, you die and pass on, somebody else gets it, another raccoon may get it, a possum may take it, but you have a right to property. There is private property. It's not owned collectively. Deer don't own a bunch of property collectively. They will stake out what they consider to be their own turf. So you have a natural right or a law of nature that says you get the right to property. The law of nature says you have a right to liberty. Now, significantly, you look, elk don't enslave possum, and rabbits don't enslave cows. There's over 10 million species in nature, and you don't have slavery. A couple of people point to, well, that's slavery. Now, the folks who deal with this say that's not slavery. So there's no slavery. Well, how come our founders didn't understand that? I mean, if they wrote the laws of nature, nature's God. Well, what happens, our education is so lousy, and we look for every opportunity to demean the Founding Fathers that we're happy to point out slave owners. And for example, I was at a law school recently, and I put up the picture of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, 56 of them, and I said, you know, isn't it unfortunate all these guys are racist, slave owners, bigots? And they all said, yeah, that is unfortunate. It's too bad America's founded that way. I said, by the way, who in that picture owned slaves? And they said, well, Thomas Jefferson. I said, who else? They didn't name a second.
Couldn't get any further.
I said, no, wait a minute. There's 56 folks here. You named one that owned slaves, and so on the basis of one owning slaves, they're all slave owners and racist and bigots. Is that what you're telling? And they didn't know what to say. And so I started going through and showing all the anti-slavery founding. About 70% of the founding fathers would be anti-slavery, abolitionists, released slaves. So those 70% jumped the other 30% and said, guys, this violates the laws of nature. There is nothing in the law of nature that enslaves any others. This is a violation of natural law. And so the abolitionists, John Quincy Adams and others that we've talked about, that's what they used was the laws. They didn't use any scriptures. They didn't need to. It's the law of nature.
Wow.
In the same way, moral rights and wrongs come from nature. For example, there is no species in nature that kills its young while it's still in the womb. There's nothing in natural law for abortion. I don't care whether you're evolution or creation. Abortion, killing the young in the womb, is a violation of all natural processes.
So based on just natural law, you can have a pro-life argument.
That's right. I don't need scriptures to say that. I can say the same with homosexuality. It exists in a few species in nature, 10 million species. You can find a few that have it occasionally, but even in those species it's an aberration, which is why the early American law books, Blackstone's and other American law books, they didn't use the Bible to say it was wrong. It was called the crime against nature.
No kidding.
It violates the laws of nature. And they aren't made by human beings, and we can pass laws all day long and say we suspend the law of gravity. It doesn't matter. It's a law of nature. You're not going to suspend gravity.
Yeah.
So that's the position they had. So when they said the laws of nature, that told them certain things were right and wrong. I mean, try finding rape in nature. As a matter of fact, you have a right of association in nature. Once you're born, you can pick the herd you want to run with. And you run with that herd, and if you decide, I'm tired of that herd of deer, I'm going to that herd of deer, you can do that. You can, and that's what the Founding Fathers called the right of expatriation. I can leave one herd and join another. That's where you get the First Amendment right of association. I can choose to be with who I want to.
Yeah.
So all of these are natural rights. Now, here's the problem. Being a cowboy like I am, under the laws of nature, is theft a common part of the laws of nature? Now, you bet it is. Got several horses. I'll feed them. They'll try to steal the food from the other horses. They don't stick with their own. They want everybody else's food. And then when you look at nature, is adultery common in nature? Oh, yeah. Monogamy is not normal. That's why you have one bull and 40 cows. It's because monogamy is not common.
Yeah.
Then you look at nature and you say, is murder common in nature? Absolutely. You ever see what a skunk does inside a hen house? They don't go in there to eat the meat. They go in there to slaughter the chickens. And then you look at things like incest. Is that common in nature? Absolutely. That's why a cowboy will not ride a Mustang, because they've been inbred for so many generations, they don't have stamina and strength. Well, if the laws of nature is what we use, then how do you explain that? That's where you have the laws of nature's God. God comes through and the Ten Commandments say, don't murder. It may be common in nature, you don't murder. And by the way, you don't steal. And by the way, and so between the laws of nature and nature's God, you get rights and wrongs.
So it's nature's God that really civilizes you then.
It is.
Mean, instead of being the wild laws of nature, you got...
see, that's where inalienable rights come from. I have an inalienable right to life that came without any civil government telling me. I have a right to liberty. From the moment I'm born, I have the right to be free. I have the right to associate with who I want to. I have the right for certain sexual behavior not to be part, like rape, things like that. That's not part of the laws of nature. I have the right to defend myself. Whether you like it or not, I've got a right. That's a natural law. And so that's really the origin of what we have as the Bill of Rights. And when you look at the Bill of Rights, and we're going to study the rest of those, you went First Amendment in the last lesson, we'll go through the other amendments this time. Their origin really tracks back to the laws of nature, nature's God, which establishes a fixed moral absolute. It is absolutely 100% right to protect the right to life. It's 100% right to protect the right of self-defense, because those are established by God.
And that's the becoming civilized part, is the role of government is to protect those
rights.
So you've got a right to that life. And so if in nature something was trying to take your life, it's government's job to protect. You have a right to protect yourself from it, but even if you couldn't,
that's right.
The government's job is
And by the way, it's often the government who violates those rights.
Yeah.
It's not just individuals. It's not just thugs that try to take my property. The government tried to take my property through the takings, and that's why we put the takings clause in the Fifth Amendment to say, government, you can't take private property. You got to leave it alone. It's individuals' private property. And I want to defend myself, and the government says, you can't defend yourself. You can't own guns. No, it's not. And so it's often the government that violates the very rights, and therefore we say, government, these are off limits to you, and not only can you not violate them, you have to protect them.
Yeah.
And that's what creates a civilized
speaking of guns
society.
and the Second Amendment, that'll be the first one we get to when we get to Philly. But before we go to Philly, I wanted to mention in our workbook we have an article that we reprinted from you on slavery and the Founding Fathers, because you were mentioning that. Chance to dive in a lot deeper there, and folks can get it on your website at wallbuilders.com. All right, well, let's go back to Philadelphia to Independence Hall. We'll dive in a little deeper to the 2nd through the 10th Amendments, those inalienable rights. In fact, the kids are going to help teach there at Independence Hall. How about the Second Amendment? As a Texan, you know I'm going to want to cover the Second Amendment a little bit, right? So instead of me covering it, though, I'm going to ask for another one of my boys to come up. Reagan Green is going to come up and help us out, and he's going to share with us a little bit about the Second Amendment. Y'all welcome Reagan. Come on up, buddy. Look at him, bub.
Richard Henry Lee was the founding father in the Continental Congress who made the motion for America's independence on June 7th, 1776, who, by the way, was sitting right over here when our Declaration of Independence was signed. Lee once said, "To preserve liberty, it is essential that the whole body of all people possess arms and be taught how to use them, especially when young." This might explain why John Quincy Adams, 6th President of the United States, was out with the Massachusetts Minutemen doing musket drills when he was only 8 years old. The Founding Fathers said that the Second Amendment is the one that protects all our other freedoms. It says, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." At that time, the militia was every man that could fire a rifle. So this freedom wasn't for the official military, it was for we the people, which is why it says, "The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." Even if you don't like hunting or guns as much as our family, you would be wise to help protect the rights of other families like ours so we can keep our guns, just in case someday we need to use those guns to help protect your rights. Please welcome back my dad.
Good job, buddy. All right, way to go. And no, I'm sorry, we won't be having shooting lessons tonight outside. Okay, so that's it for tonight. But, you know, with the movie Red Dawn being redone, I think it's important that we all recognize that Second Amendment, just in case we do get invaded behind. Anyway, all right, so there's the Second Amendment for you. A lot of debate on that issue over the years. The Supreme Court did hear that case, the McDonald case we talked about last night, that finally, for the first time, Supreme Court weighed in and said, yes, it is an individual right to keep and bear arms. That was something that was really up in the air as far as how the court would rule on that over the years. So there's your Second Amendment. Third Amendment is quartering soldiers. Let's all just kind of turn there and we'll read through that one real quick. And, you know, I used to be concerned about this when I first read it because I was worried, you know, oh man, I don't want quartering of soldiers in my house if I don't want it. All right, so let's just take a look here. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. And think about what they were trying to stop here. You remember in the Revolutionary period, you had quartering of soldiers forced by the British. So, I mean, you might have had a guy that was actually out fighting for the American side, and the Brits are allowing their soldiers, forcing their soldiers to stay in his home with his wife and his kids. Bad deal, right? You don't want the quartering of soldiers to be forced on you. What our Third Amendment was trying to do was put a stop to that. Now, what it says is if we're at peace, no quartering of soldiers in my home without my permission. But if we're in a time of war, it could be done in a manner prescribed by law. Let me tell you why I'm not concerned about that. Because if Red Dawn really does happen, if we get invaded, I want the soldiers staying in my house. You know what I'm saying? I'm cooking them. If I'm not out fighting, I'm going to be feeding them, and I'm going to be clothing them, and I'm going to give them shelter. Hopefully I'll be out fighting myself. But I'm fine with the Third Amendment. I think it's actually a good idea if Red Dawn comes true. So anyway, that's Third Amendment. Now let's look at the Fourth Amendment, searches and seizures. And let's read through it. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Let me just save you some time. Yes, I think TSA is violating the Fourth Amendment. I know somebody's going to ask that. In Texas, we had a bill passed, actually. Our lieutenant governor sold us out at the very end. We got it through both houses that would have limited these searches and seizures at the airport. I mean, I got my pastor's wife, dainty, sweet little lady. I mean, she's been just, practically molested at the airport over this stuff, and it's just crazy. It's gotten out of hand. Hey, I'm all for security. I think the federal government should be involved in airport security. I just think we're going too far with what we're doing, and I do think we've got some Fourth Amendment questions being raised there, and I think you got some members of Congress that are raising that, and I think you'll see some changes over time. But enough said on that one. We could spend all night on that and don't have time. Fifth Amendment. Let's look at. There's a lot in the Fifth Amendment. What do we usually think of on the Fifth Amendment? I plead the Fifth, right? We always think of that right against self-incrimination, but there's a whole lot more in here. Let's look at the other stuff. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment of or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself, so there's that right against self-incrimination, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. Man, there's a lot here. I mean, we could spend a lot of time on this one. Just to highlight a couple of things here real quick. You notice the exception for the military. That's one of the reasons that there was such an uproar over the idea of bringing enemy combatants here and giving them constitutional rights, because then you're actually elevating them in terms of their rights above our own military. The guys and gals that are putting their lives on the line for us don't have the same constitutional rights as a terrorist that you bring back home to the United States and put them on trial and give them our constitutional rights in the court system. So that's part of the reason for the uproar over that. The thing that I think is really missed here in the Fifth Amendment is the idea of private property not being taken for public use without just compensation. Me personally, my view, and frankly a lot of other people out there as well, we are taking property all over the place without compensation through regulation. In other words, we don't actually take the property completely from you, but we'll regulate your property to where we devalue the property. Back 20 years ago, I did a paper on a lady in Austin, Texas, who they had found an endangered species on her property. It was called a golden cheek warbler. I've never seen one. I don't think my life will be ruined if I never do, but at any rate, it was listed by the Fish and Wildlife. Because they found one of those on her property, they declared her property a bird sanctuary for the golden cheek warbler and told her she couldn't use that property for anything except protecting that bird. Her property was valued at $1 million before they found it, $30,000 after. No compensation. Okay, look, I'm all for saving the American wolf, saving the bald eagle. I mean, there's some things out there I think we should do what we can to save. But I have a real problem with us as a society saying to you, we want to save this, you pay for it. That's why the Fifth Amendment says if society wants to force something on you that devalues your property, we're supposed to compensate you for it. But we've let this thing slide in a lot of areas. I mean, there's a lot of things we could go through. I think Endangered Species Act is probably the most egregious, because now it's not about animals anymore. Now we're saving bugs and beetles and maggots and warblers and I mean just all kinds of stuff. It's just gotten out of hand is what's happened. It's gotten unreasonable and untenable. Fifth Amendment would go a long way if we would just recognize what it says and what it was intended to do, and we could come back and protect a lot of that. All right, Sixth Amendment. This is where we get our speedy public trial. A lot of stuff in this one. Let's go ahead and read it as well. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him. That's your right to confront your accusers that we always hear of. To have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. So speedy public jury trial, witnesses, and attorney. That's the easiest way to remember everything there in the Sixth Amendment. Obviously, a lot of stuff we want to protect there, and there's also, I think, some abuses of that. I think a lot of times we don't get that speedy trial. A lot of times we have, these days, situations, friends of mine, frankly, I've been in this situation. Politics is a nasty business, where political motivations cause DAs and prosecutors to go after politicians and just string it out as long as they can to cause as much pain as they possibly can, and never actually get them in front of a jury because they know it's trumped up bogus charges. There's a lot of abuse that happens there, and I think it violates what the founders intended for the Sixth Amendment for sure. I do just point out right at the end to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. The Constitution does not guarantee, at least in the clear language here, that we'll pay for your counsel, but that's been our custom in America, and I think that's a good thing. I think, you know, if you're in jeopardy of your life or limb and you can't afford counsel, I think as a society, that's a good thing for us to provide that, and that's why we do that here in America. It probably speaks well to our efforts to make sure that no one is wrongly convicted, or as few, I mean, you're going to have flaws in any system, any judicial system that you have. I think we go to great lengths to make sure that if there's a flaw in our system that we catch it and we can reverse it. So a lot there in the Sixth Amendment. Now, Seventh Amendment, this is where you get your right to a jury trial in a civil case. But there's a big hurdle here. I mean, it's a huge hurdle. There's got to be a lot of money at stake. Everybody look down at the Seventh Amendment there and tell me how much money's got to be at stake for you to get your jury trial in a civil case. $20, man, $20. So we're talking, I mean, unless you're suing the gumball manufacturer because you got the wrong ring, you're probably going to be able to get your jury trial. All right, so that's the Seventh Amendment. Also, Seventh Amendment incorporates the common law. So it's important for us to remember that. In suits at common law where the value and controversy shall exceed $20, right of jury trial shall be preserved, and no fact tried by jury, I will love this, I wish we still did this, no fact tried by a jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. Boy, we have lost that one. Let me tell you, the influence and the last bastion of protection of a jury trial has really been lost in our jurisprudence today. It used to be we actually called them courts of justice because the goal was justice, right? Then we started calling them courts of law, and now we just call them courts. And the way that has devolved, in my opinion, we've lost a lot of justice. Because used to, you had the right of what we call jury nullification. A jury could say, yes, the law says this, yes, the person did this, but we as a jury think that's an unjust law or it is unjustly applied in this situation, and the jury was the one that would protect an unjust law from being forced on someone. These days, man, we basically say to a jury, fill in the blanks, yes or no, that's your only option. And we take away their real opportunity to have the final decision in so many of these different cases out there. And without getting too far in the weeds, I just think we need to rethink the fact that a jury of our peers should have the ability to hear everything in the case. We ought to stop holding stuff back from the jury, and the jury of our peers ought to have the ability to reason and make the final decision. And unfortunately today, we do very little of that, and we allow anything that the jury does pretty much to now be appealed and a judge overturn what the jury did. Yes, sir?
Our question on that is, has the law changed or just the methodology changed? Because my understanding is jury nullification is still an option.
Yeah.
They almost never tell the jury that's an option.
Not only do they not tell them, they either ignore it or overrule it. I mean, you end up with your de novo decisions and your judges that are saying, hey, you know what, the jury might have found that, but we're smarter than you. And again, it's that high priest of the law mentality that the judges know better than the people. But you're right. I mean, it's still there in the Constitution. Those protections are still there, but I forget the phrase you used. Not the law has changed, but the methodology. Was that the word you used? Yeah, it's the methodology that's changed, no doubt about it. So again, it goes back to a generational change, us educating our congressmen. And here's the good news. This mentality of the law moving away from a constitutional basis and a strict constructionist basis to this living, breathing document thing, most law schools are all into this living, breathing document thing. Empower the judiciary, empower the legal community, because we're all too dumb to do it. But you've got some new law schools over the last 20 years or so that are raising up a whole new crop of attorneys and future judges that are actually strict constructionists, very much into the Founding Fathers, studying all the things that we're talking about, and not so sold out to stare decisis to say that it doesn't matter what the Founders did, it's what the last judge said. And they're saying, no, it does matter what the Founders did. If the last judge on the decision got it wrong, we need to correct that. If the judges were so perfect, Dred Scott would still be the law of the land. The Supreme Court of the United States said that no black man has any right that any white man has to recognize. Well, that was wrong, wasn't it? But we don't say just because the court said it, we're never going to overturn it. We say, hey, the court gets things wrong, we need to correct it. And if they get their interpretation wrong of what the founders in this room said for the Constitution, we need to correct it over time. And empowering the jury and us knowing. And you know, a great point on that, sir, is that we should make sure that we educate our friends and family and neighbors and say, you know what, don't run from jury duty. We need you on the jury. That's one of our responsibilities under this Constitution. I mean, we want good justice. We want a good system. We've got to be willing to go serve. I know it's only $6 a day. I know it's painful to do. It takes you away from your family. It takes us away from our work. But it's a duty that we have. If we want good government, we've got to participate in that government. And maybe the more we know about it, we can raise it when we're on a jury panel. We can ask the judge, why don't we have the opportunity to hear that evidence? Why don't we have the opportunity to actually make the decision, not just fill in the blanks that you've got for us here? So I think this can get better. Partly because of we the people getting more educated, but also because of these law schools and new attorneys that are getting turned out there. Okay, Eighth Amendment, excessive fines and bail, cruel and unusual punishment. Actual language says excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. And of course, we all know that what that means is if you go to prison, you should get a very nice fluffy pillow and a color television and movies that, that it used to be that bad, right? I mean, you remember when the federal courts ran the prison system for so many years, in Texas it was that way, and they put the most ridiculous. Now we're getting back to busting rocks. Now we're getting back to saying when you're in prison, it ought to be painful, it ought to be a bad experience, you ought to be working hard, not just sitting around. So hopefully that tide has turned back to a clearer understanding of what they thought cruel and unusual. Cruel and unusual punishment is not busting rocks. Cruel and unusual punishment is not staying in a tent or not having, the most perfect surroundings and air conditioning and all that kind of stuff.
What about those prisons that are letting people out because they say they don't have enough money and resources to keep them in prison?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on that. My first is that the way our culture is working right now, the state has a duty and responsibility to protect us from dangerous people, and they need to make that a priority over a lot of the programs that we spend money on that are not the state's jurisdiction and responsibility to do. So I think the government is failing us when they let someone out that has not served their time or for good behavior is getting out early because they deserve it. If they're just getting out because we can't afford the prison cell, our priorities are messed up. But I would also add to that I personally am not for imprisonment in a lot of the cases that we're putting people in prison for. I believe very much in restitution. I believe and this comes from my faith. My personal faith has a model of punishment that is defined as restitution, not jail. And therefore you should have opportunities for someone that does a nonviolent crime, if they steal a car or they, a theft is a perfect example, for that person to have to work and repay 2 times, 4 times, whatever, or at least what they stole. See, our problem in society, our society today, is we punish the perpetrator and there's never any restitution to the victim. There's no, well, in most cases there's no. Some states have done a little better at having funds and whatnot go to a state fund where there's counseling and different things provided for victims, but it's not actually funding the loss of property or economic loss to that person. So I think it's a much better system to have restitution so that the person that commits the crime has a chance to be rehabilitated, to seek forgiveness from the person that they hurt, and to make right what they did. And part of this, I just happened to read a book. Well, actually, I got to hear him speak and then read his book, Kingdom Agenda. It was a pastor in Texas named Tony Evans. I don't know if you ever heard of Dr. Tony Evans, but he's, just great black pastor in Dallas that has done such a great job of helping to reform his community. And he came to us and he said, guys, he said, look, what we do in our church, we go to the judges and we say, hey, if a kid from our church gets busted stealing a car or whatever it might be, you give that kid to us and we will make sure that he goes to work, that he pays back what he stole, and that we rehabilitate him. If we don't do that, then throw him in jail. And so he got judges to start doing shock probation, where they'd say, okay, they put him in the jail for 2 days, and then they say, okay, you're now being turned over to the elders of this church, and you're responsible to them, and if they tell us you didn't do what you're supposed to do, then you're going to come back to prison. And man, that works great. I mean, that is such a better way to do it. It's better for the victim. It's better for the person that committed the crime, because I don't believe that, I mean, we have a lot of people, especially in those situations where you have a 15-year-old kid or somebody early, all of us make mistakes, right? And this kid gets in the wrong crowd, makes a mistake. We put them in prison for 5 years, and they learn how to be a better criminal instead of learning how to make it right. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not some softy. I served on the Criminal Jurisprudence Committee when I was in the legislature. I'm pretty tough on crime, so don't get the wrong perception here of me. There's a lot of criminals that I think we ought to throw away the key and never let them out, all right? But there are some that we just need to do a better job of dealing with it early on. And if they don't straighten up, then get them in prison. But there's a lot of them we could do a lot better. And I'm more concerned about the victim than I am the perpetrator in the first place. So anyway, I know y'all didn't come here for a sermon. I didn't mean to get off on that, but it was a great question. And I think it does come back to how do we make our system work? How do we make our government work? Because we're going broke, aren't we? I mean, we're absolutely going broke, and prisons are a big part of that. And if you go back to what these guys said, what did Washington say? What were the indispensable supports of political prosperity? Religion, morality. If you take the morality out, you need a whole lot more prison beds, don't you? What did the former Speaker of the House, Robert Winthrop, he said, you're either going to be ruled by the Bible or the bayonet, right? You're either going to have a self-control or government has to be involved. In fact, it's the very reason government has to grow. Because as we don't police ourselves, government has to come in and police us. Why do you think we have all the cries for more regulation of Wall Street and all those things? Because instead of having ethical capitalism, we got out of hand. And when you get out of hand, then people are going to ask for government to come in and stop you from violating the ethics and the morals of the society. So it's a great question, and it's an area that we definitely need to come back to these guys and their philosophy and what they did. If we'll get that thinking back in place, we can change even these areas like you're talking about in the criminal law back to a system that'll create a better society. But I think you're always going to have more crime and necessarily more punishment if you move away from the concept that, hey, my freedom comes from God, therefore when I take an oath, when I act out, I've got to live my freedom respecting His authority. It's just going to be a difference in culture. It's just going to create a different outcome. Last one, Ninth Amendment. We covered the 10th Amendment last night, so I'm not going to cover much on that, but I do want to compare it to the Ninth Amendment. You remember how we talked about with the 10th Amendment, it defined for us the concepts of enumerated powers, meaning we've got a bucket over here with a lid on it. All the powers of Congress and the federal government are in that bucket, and there's a lid on it. We listed everything. These guys took the time to list everything the federal government could do. The Ninth Amendment says it's the opposite for we the people, that our personal freedoms are not exhaustive in the Constitution. So let's take a look at the Ninth. It says the enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people, which is why the 10th then says we've got that bucket we gave to the federal government, that bucket we took away from the states, everything else is left to the people or the states, and we're not taking the time to list it because it's not going to be an exhaustive list in the Constitution. Now some say, well, that's where you find the right, for instance, to abortion or the right for other things that aren't actually listed in the Constitution. On all of those issues, I would just urge you to make sure that anything you're going to read into the Constitution, or as Jefferson said, what might be squeezed into the Constitution, it cannot violate the other parts of the Constitution or the Declaration, as we talked about last night. That's the foundation that the Constitution was built on. So if you're depriving someone of life, then you're violating the 14th Amendment, you're violating other parts of the Constitution, you're violating the Declaration of Independence. So it is not possible to find some right in the Constitution that would then violate other areas of the Constitution. So if the Fifth Amendment says you're not going to be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, if you take a baby's life without having due process of law, then you're depriving that baby of life. You're violating the Fifth Amendment right there. So anyway, 10th Amendment we talked about last night, and don't need to spend any more time on that. So there you have it, all 10 out of the Bill of Rights. There's a lot there, I know, and we could spend a whole lot more time. But remember, this is the quick start guide. We're just flipping out the chart. We're showing where all the pieces are. We're showing where to plug it in so that we can ask more questions later and study a little bit deeper.
The Founding Fathers said that the Second Amendment is the one that protects all our other freedoms. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed.
All right, David, so there's those individual rights, 2nd through the 10th. We've covered everything now in terms of specifics out of this.
Let's go back for a minute and hit why we have the Bill of Rights. I mean, you go back to those guys at the Constitutional Convention, and George Mason is the guy. He's one of the 55. He literally, interestingly, why he didn't sign the Constitution. One thing is he's a slave owner, but the Constitution didn't abolish slavery. Now, they tried to do that, and there were 3 southern states that particularly didn't want to abolish slavery, and they said, you do that, we're walking out, and they wanted the United States, and so it's called the Great Compromise, not a very good compromise. But nonetheless,
there was a lot of debate and discussion about that issue, for sure.
He is a slave owner. He said, the Constitution did not abolish slavery. I'm not signing it. Why would a slave owner do that? Because in Virginia, it was illegal for guys like him to release their own slaves.
So he wanted to end it.
He wanted to end it. And that's why he wanted an end to it, because in the convention, he reminded them that there is a God, He is just. If we maintain slavery, we're going to be in trouble with Him. And actually, you have Madison and others predict that they said a great civil war would be the result. And lo and behold, you know, and so Lincoln had that same viewpoint. He said, hey, a just God, every drop of blood shed on the back of a slave, if that's going to be extracted during this war, in just God. And so number one was it didn't end slavery. But number two, knowing the propensities of government, and having experienced so many in their life, bad state governments and bad federal governments, or in that case, international governments with Great Britain, but that would be the federal level for us. Having experienced bad governments, he wanted a lot more boundaries put around government. So even though they made it clear that the only things Congress can do are these 15 things right here, nothing more than 2 later added in amendments, that's the only things Congress can do, nothing more. He still didn't think that was enough.
He wants an extra layer of protection just in case you get bad people in office or people that are ignorant and don't, I don't mean that but stupid. I mean, they don't know what these protections are and the original intent. I want that extra protection to protect from government and those inalienable rights.
And so he gets with other delegates that didn't sign, and you have other delegates that didn't sign, like Elbert Sherry, Richard Henry Lee, etc. They didn't sign, and they'd been chosen part of the convention. And so he says, all right, you guys go back to your states, let's agitate for this. And so when the ratification of the Constitution came to several states, it almost failed in several states because they wanted specific exceptions. We want something that says the government cannot mess with our rights of conscience and our free exercise of religion. We want stuff that says they can't mess with our speech, they can't mess with our property, they can't mess with our assembly, they can't mess with our petition. And so that's the impetus behind the Bill of Rights. Now,
so even as the Constitution was being ratified in these states, this movement is happening. There's a growing sense of urgency to have the Bill of Rights.
And he was kind of the catalyst on that, and so the Bill of Rights is much the result of his spurring this on, which is why he gets called the father of the Bill of Rights. Now, going to those Bill of Rights and what those Bill of Rights did specifically, I mean, go back to what we said about the frame of the Declaration. All right, we've got 155 words. This is for 6 immutable principles. Principle number 1, there's a divine creator. Principle number 2, rights come from God. Principle number 3, government exists to protect those rights. All right, that fixed moral law we talked about the first part with Blackstone's, that becomes the basis of inalienable rights. We're going to tell government there are certain things it cannot touch because they're inalienable rights, they're rights that come from God, they're part of the laws of nature, nature's God, and they're off limits. And so that's literally what we get. And Blackstone is the one who gives us that phrase, the laws of nature, nature's God. And so that's what we discussed before we looked at those other amendments. Now, having said that, when you look at the Bill of Rights, let's take a few of those amendments that you really got into well. And I just want to kind of pile on while we have the opportunity.
Let's do it.
Let's kick this can so hard nobody can ever reshape it back into a... I mean, let's get this thing really done.
And I'd like to know more of the founders' views on some of these amendments, because even in Philly, I mean, we went through what they are, but some of those, we didn't have a lot of quotes from the founders to back up the intent, the original intent of that.
Let's take the Second Amendment for a moment. And let me go back. And what you're going to see with several quotes in the Second Amendment from the founders is government cannot restrain, cannot repeal, cannot regulate this right. Now, the Second Amendment is the right of self-defense. They often called it the first law of nature, the law of self-preservation, or the biblical right of self-defense.
So this is that mayor kicking you in the forehead to protect...
We're going to really nail it. And let me show you why, understanding from Blackstone's standpoint, this is a law of nature, why you cannot regulate or restrict this. With talking about animals on our ranch and farm, we also raise sheep. And so I have a great cat. It's more like a dog than a cat, which is, I love this cat. I mean, it's a really cool cat. But with ewes that we have, there's a ewe and this cat and this ewe really like each other. And they kind of play together in the field. And so we go through winter, and this ewe gets down at night and got the thick wool there. Well, this cat burrows right up in that wool, and the ewe loves it and the cat loves it. And so they have this great symbiotic relationship until about a week ago. And the ewe had twins. And after she had twins, that night, cat goes out, snuggle up. That cat gets pounded in the ground. It suddenly changed because that instinct of self-protection. So the federal government can pass all the laws it wants to prevent sheep from pounding cats in the ground. Not going to make any difference. It's law of nature.
Yeah, laws of nature are going to kick in.
Laws of nature are going to kick in. That a lot of times it's the government that violates these rights, and that's why they wanted to put regulations around the government. So the right of self-defense could be from thugs who want to break into my home, but it could be from the government who wants to break into my home. Because what did they do? They just fought a war against a government that was unjust, that was tyrannical, and don't think that they were quick to pick up arms and fight Great Britain. They went for 11 years. They busted their tail to solve reconciliation every way they could.
Yeah, they tried everything they could.
They tried every way they could. They were not looking for a fight. They wanted to avoid the fight. As a matter of fact, it was 6 years after the British started firing bullets at us before we separated. So we send the Olive Branch petition, we send all these things trying to reconcile, and we can't get it done. So don't think that these guys were quick to jump up and start shooting at government that was a wicked, evil government, tyrannical. That wasn't it. I mean, they tried their best to use every political means they could, every means of petition and appeal. They sent Benjamin Franklin to Great Britain to argue their case in front of the British ministry. I mean, they tried everything they could. So they end up having to take on their own homeland. These were their citizens. Yeah. I'm a British citizen. I'm having to fight my government. I don't want to do this. But also watch how they talk about that it is often the governments that are the first to violate Second Amendment rights. So I'm just going to go through some of these real quick, and I'm telling you, we're just piling on.
Let's do it.
For example, you got Zephaniah Swift. Now, this founding father who did the first ever law books in America. That's our original law books. That's from 1795, and he talks about this natural law of self-defense. And this is what he said in his law books. He said, self-defense or self-preservation is one of the first laws of nature which no man ever resigned on entering into society. You don't give up your inalienable rights when you come into society. Then you got James Kent. Now these are James Kent's law books. He is the American Blackstone. He took Blackstone because Blackstone did it for British law. He took all the same principles and he said, here's the American case law.
So this one was in Connecticut. Where was he? Or was that
this
for
is
the whole
national.
nation?
This
Okay,
is national. 1824. He's the guy that he really laid the foundation for American jurisprudence. So he and Joseph Story, the two guys considered as having made American law, because prior to that it was British. So now we're doing the same principles, but with American application. So here's what he says in his law books about this. The municipal law of our country has likewise left with individuals the exercise of the natural right of self-defense. There it is again, natural right. And that's left with individuals. He said, the right of self-defense is founded in the law of nature and is not and cannot be superseded by the law of society. So I don't care what New York or California or Texas or Oklahoma says about you don't have a right to have guns to defend yourself. That's a law of nature, and it cannot be superseded by any law of society. Now, keep going. Here we've got Joseph Story. This is Story's Commentaries on the Constitution. This is the great book that really everybody ought to get a modern version of this because it's great stuff on the Constitution. And so Joseph Story.
So you did Kent and Story, and back to back, these are the two.
These are the two guys that laid the foundation for American law. Okay. And I mean, his father was one of the Indians in the Boston Tea Party. So this guy has just a little bit of patriotism in his blood, you know, just growing up seeing that, being part of that. And so, I mean, he's a great guy, but he's one of the founders of American jurisprudence the way we have it. And this is what he said. He said, the right of the citizens to keep and bear arms has justly been considered as the palladium of the liberties of a republic, since it offers a strong moral check against the usurpation and arbitrary power of rulers. Rulers? I thought we had the right of self-defense against crooks. No, he says rulers. Now remember, right of self-defense doesn't matter who comes at you, whether it's the government or whether it's somebody else. Yeah. But he says it offers a strong moral check. Moral check? You mean owning guns is a moral check? It's a moral issue? Yeah, it's the law of nature. Like that. He says a strong moral check against the usurpation and arbitrary power of rulers and will enable the people to triumph over them. The people are to win this thing one way or the other. And you don't ever want to have to use guns against civil authority. But if they're going to do the British thing, you've got a right of self-defense.
Well, and if it's a check, then hopefully by being an armed nation, you prevent that government from ever encroaching in the first place.
In our case, because of our form of government, if we ever get to the point where we have to do that, it's because we've been so sloppy lazy, we never use the political tools.
That's right.
Because again, we have the political tools.
We have the peaceable means.
We have the peaceable means. But with only 1 out of 6 Americans choosing their president, and only 1 out of 8 Americans choosing their governors and senators and reps, if it gets to the point of needing something, it's because we put ourselves in that position. So He continues this, there is certainly no small danger that indifference may lead to disgust, and disgust to contempt, and thus gradually undermine all the protection intended by this clause of our National Bill of Rights. Now, grab that. He says, if you don't respect the Second Amendment, I don't care about guns. If you're indifferent, that may lead to disgust. Disgust may lead to contempt, and that will undermine the protection intended by the Second Amendment. This is why you protect all the amendments, all the natural rights, all the inalienable rights, even if you don't use them.
Even if it's not when you're exercising. Well, that's really where we are in many cases. I mean, most of the people that want to infringe on the Second Amendment, they're at that point of disgust.
That's
really
right.
where they are. It was indifference. Now they've bought this lie that the gun is the problem.
That's right.
And so now they've got disgust about an inanimate object, and so it's leading to us gradually losing that right.
Which gives the government the authority to regulate it. And when the government starts regulating any inalienable right, it will start regulating every inalienable. Because, again, there's nothing higher than government in its mind. If it can take an inalienable right, it'll do it. Here's some more. George Mason, we've talked about George Mason, his influence. This is what he said. He said, 40 years ago, when the resolution of enslaving America was formed in Great Britain, the British Parliament was advised to disarm the people, that it was the best and most effectual way to enslave them, but that they should not do it openly, but to weaken them and to let them sink gradually. Let's just, you keep those guns, but you know, you don't need an AR-15 to hunt deer. I mean, a shotgun. And so what they do is this gradual frog boiling in water kind of thing. If it's an inalienable right, it is off limits to government, period. All the way across the board. And that's the way you have to think if you're going to keep the government within its jurisdiction.
Now, you would think these guys actually thought maybe this was an individual right, too. This is not a government.
Yeah,
I mean, they keep talking about this inalienable
Strange
individual
thing.
right. And today, people talk about it, oh, no, it's a group right, or it's militia, or it's military. No.
Go
These are the guys that gave it to us.
back to the laws of nature. If a ewe has her lamb attacked, is it going to be the whole crowd of sheep that come defend it? No, it's going to be that ewe standing up and defending right there what's going on. Now, there are times when they get together and they collectively defend, as caribou will do and as elk will do and others, but that elk individually is going to work his tail off first to defend everything he can, and if they need to get in the crowd, they will. And this is why the Founding Fathers looked at the right of self-defense first as an individual right, but you know what? I have an individual right to join with you for self-defense, and that's where we start getting malicious.
Just because we join together doesn't take away that individual right.
That's
you
right.
first need the individual right to be able to join together.
Well, and that's why the Pennsylvania provision for the Second Amendment said that the people have a right to bear arms in defense of themselves and the state.
There you go.
So you do it for yourself, and if you want to join with others to defend the state, you can do that, but it's an individual right, and sometimes we exercise that right collectively, as the elk or caribou or others do, bighorn sheep. So it's a natural right. So you go to Sam Adams, we're going to keep pounding this in the ground. Sam Adams says this, the Constitution should never be construed to prevent the people of the United States who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms. Really? I don't think we're listening.
That right there drives it home.
It does. It should never be construed, ever.
Why is there even a debate on this? I mean, these quotes are not wishy-washy, they're not muddy, they're clear.
And see, he's one of the chief guys in Massachusetts that caused the ratification of the Constitution almost to fail there because he wanted protections for individual rights. So as George Mason did in Virginia, Sam Adams is a big leader up in Massachusetts, and this is what they're real emphatic on. We want these limitations around the government, and the Constitution should never be construed. That's why we put the Second Amendment there.
Yeah.
Then you look at Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry says, the great object is that every man be armed. Everyone who is able may have a gun. We're trying to make that as hard as possible today. We'll do all these checks and continue. Richard Henry Lee, the guy who made the motion in Congress to separate from Great Britain, but he's a framer of the Bill of Rights. So he is one of the framers in Congress of this amendment. This is what he said. He said, to preserve liberty, it's essential that the whole body of the people always possess arms and be taught alike, especially when young, how to use them. Whoa, teaching kids?
I love
These
that.
are radicals.
Teach the young, yes.
Well, we're supposed to teach it to the rising generation. Remember John Jay said, teach these rights to the rising generation. These rights include the right to keep and bear arms. Teach it to the rising generation. And as John Quincy Adams pointed out, the sooner you do that, the less gun accidents you'll have.
That's right.
Accidents happen from being unfamiliar with it. Accidents happen when you get behind the wheel of a car and you don't have the experience to drive it. Accidents happen when you don't have experience with guns. And you pick one up and you're curious about it, and that's what they knew and believed. Keep going. George Washington said this. He said, a free people ought to be armed.
Right.
Real simple. Yeah. Then you've got James Madison. James Madison said, the advantage of being armed is an advantage which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. In the several kingdoms of Europe, the governments are afraid to trust people with arms. He said, not here. In Europe, they don't want you to, You know, we get this impetus. Even some of our Supreme Court justices said, "Oh, don't copy the American Constitution. Be more like Europe. You know, they're so progressive and they're avant-garde. They're so cool." I love how the Founding Fathers back then, with the same pressure to be sophisticated, be like Europe. Look at what Thomas Jefferson said about this, about being like Europe. Love this. He says, "The comparisons of our governments with those of Europe are like a comparison of heaven and hell."
That's a big difference right there.
Exactly. In Europe, they don't want you to have guns, mess around with the gun. And it's not just in this area, it's in so many areas, because in Europe, again, they were secular governments, so government was God. In America, no. Government is to serve the people. God is God, people serve God, and government serves the people.
And these guys knew the difference. They had come out from under that, so they wanted...
They've been there, that's right. Yeah, been there, done that.
Why today do we look at Europe and say, "Oh, we want to be like that"? Why can't we learn from our Founding Fathers? So
well, we can if we ever studied history, and that's what we're doing here.
That's what we're doing, bring it to life, remember what these guys did.
That's right. Yeah. And here's what Jefferson said about the Second Amendment. He says, "No citizen shall be debarred the use of arms within his own lands." Again, it's an inalienable right. You can't take it away. John Adams says it this way. He says, "Resistance to sudden violence for the preservation not only of my person, my limbs, and my life, but of my property is an indisputable right of nature, which I never surrendered to the public by the compact of society, and which perhaps I could not surrender if I would." In other words, you can't give up your natural rights.
Yeah.
It's like saying, I give up the right to gravity. You can't give up the right to gravity. If it's a God-given right, you don't give it back.
It looks like he's saying, too, that resistance to sudden violence is my resistance to that sudden violence. It's not just,
it's not the
you
police's
can't have the
resistance.
police on every
That's
corner.
right.
They're not going to be in every home. So if I'm going to have that resistance to sudden violence, I cannot give up that
That's right. And look what he said. He said the maxims of the law and the precepts of Christianity are precisely coincident in relation to this subject. He said, whether you want to go to the laws of nature or the laws of nature's God, you take it either way. You want to go to the Bible, I've got the right of self-defense, Exodus 22, etc. If you want to go to the laws of nature, I've got the right of self-defense. I can't give up the right of self-defense because it doesn't belong to me. It came from God. I don't give it up. So look at Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton said, the Supreme Being gave existence to man together with the means of preserving that existence. He invested man with an inviolable right, inalienable right to personal liberty and personal safety. You have a right to freedom, but you have a right to be safe with that freedom, and that's an inalienable right. And then finally, one more, and I could give a lot more, but you get the point. I mean, everybody gets the point here. This was big stuff to them, and giving it up is not small. Let me credential James Wilson for just a minute, because James Wilson is no lightweight among the Founding Fathers. One of the 6 guys who signed the Declaration and the Constitution. He is the 2nd most active member of the Constitutional Convention.
Which means he's involved in every debate.
He's involved in every debate. And they liked what he said because he's considered a master builder of the Constitution. He had so many inputs that they said, yeah, makes sense. And so significantly, he starts the first organized law school in America. Now, that's pretty cool for the guy who had that much influence to say, I want to teach the next generation these principles in our Constitution. And so I actually have his, over in the library, we've got his original law books that he wrote. George Washington put him on the U.S. Supreme Court as an original justice on the U.S. Supreme Court. So Washington, who was in the convention, saw what he did and said, you need to be on the court.
So wait, let me think about this. If I were writing the resume for someone that I would consider to be an expert on the Constitution, they gave us the Declaration, the Constitution, and served on the Supreme Court, I don't think you can get any better than that. That's pretty impressive.
And that's one of the cool things about the original justice, because under Article 3, the only thing that is required is to have a Supreme Court. As you pointed out from Steve King, Congress can constitutionally reduce the Supreme Court to nothing more than a Chief Justice sitting at a card table with a candle, and they can't. So the Constitution doesn't tell you how many justices to have. So the original Congress said to President Washington, we'll give you a Chief Justice and we'll give you 5 Associate Justices, you choose them. So he chooses 6 folks to be on the court. 3 of those 6 signed the Constitution. 2 of those 6 ratified the Constitution, and 1 of the 6 wrote the Federalist Papers.
That's pretty good.
I'm going to think that they probably understood what was constitutional, because they're the ones who, and that's why when you can use their legal commentaries and their input and their interpretation, now you're starting to see exactly how they designed it, and they showed us how it's supposed to apply. So in case it wasn't clear to us, they've made it clear.
Yeah.
So look what he says about Second Amendment issues. This is really cool. He says, the great natural law of self-preservation cannot be repealed or superseded or suspended by any human institution. Now that's pretty clear. No government can take away your right to defend yourself.
That is clearly an inalienable right. You cannot take this away.
Look at this. The right of the citizens to bear arms in defense of themselves shall not be questioned. You can't
Not
even
only can you
raise
not
the
take it
question.
away, you can't even question
You can't
it.
even question it. It's one that's off limits for government to even mess with. He continues, he says, every man's house is deemed by the law to be his castle, and the law invests him with the power and places on him the duty of the commanding officer of his house.
There
Now,
again, it's not the police's responsibility, it's our
this is the
responsibility.
castle doctrine. This is where the castle, because every man is in charge of his castle, which is his house. He said, every man's house is his castle, and if anyone be robbed in it, it shall be esteemed his own default and negligence. If you get robbed in your house, don't you blame the cops for not getting there fast enough. You're in charge of defending your house. That's a law of nature. It's a law of nature's God. If you don't do it, you're at fault. If you get robbed, it's your fault. Whoa.
Wow.
Now,
That's,
see,
that's a different perspective than what we typically teach.
That's the Second Amendment. And
You know, I wish though, David, that you had more than just one or two quotes.
You
You
know,
know,
I
I don't know
know,
how many you
I'm
just
just
went
picking and
through.
choosing.
Well, you even said it earlier. You said I'm going to pile on. I'm really going to pound
Yeah.
this into the ground. That's what we need to do. We need to know this was so overwhelming.
And
And those
people-
are not little quotes. Those are strong quotes.
And people need to know they're like this on nearly every issue.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, as we talked about, even is a business too big to fail? Should federal government bail out a private business? They've been there, done that. You know, there's so many things that we deal with, they have already dealt with.
Yeah,
So,
I bet you that people that are watching this have felt in their gut the truth about
Yeah.
some of these issues.
Yeah.
But they haven't had that ammunition. No pun intended to the topic we're covering.
That's
they,
right.
they actually pun intended. So they haven't had, though, all of that evidence to pile onto that gut feeling, and now they're getting it. So I guarantee you, I know it because they come up and tell us this all the time
Yeah.
after presentation. Wow, now I know what I felt in my gut
Yeah.
was right.
Yeah.
It's there. We've just got to draw it out.
Yeah, and the cool thing is we're able to do that. And that's why these things exist.
Yeah.
And that's why we have what we have here. Now, you know, from an intellectually honest standpoint, if people want to say, I don't care what they wanted, I want something different to say, okay, let's have that debate. But don't ever tell me the Founding Fathers didn't want this or the Constitution intended
That's right.
when we have this. If you want to be honest with me and say, you know, I don't care a flip what the Constitution says or what they want, here's the way I want to discuss it. All right, let's go to that point. Let's see who wins that.
Yeah.
But so often the courts say, you know, the Founding Fathers said, or the Founding Fathers interpreted this amendment to mean, no, that's why it's so good to go back here, and that's why we used to have a good public education
Yeah.
or government education
Because it would
system.
bring out all of
It
this
would.
education
Yeah.
that you've got here in the library.
Now,
Any of the other ones you want to
yeah,
hit from the...
let's hit the Fourth Amendment.
Okay.
You got the Fourth Amendment? Read the Fourth
All right,
Amendment.
let's check out the Fourth Amendment now. And we went over this lightly at Philadelphia, but I'd love to get more founders' quotes on this. Okay, so Fourth Amendment, a lot of people have been asking, you know, is the Fourth Amendment being violated with some of the things we do at airports and whatnot? The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized.
All right, keep that handy. We're going to come back to
Okay.
that. Now, what were the four categories that said are to be protected?
Persons, houses, papers, and effects.
Okay, now,
What's an effect?
effect?
Yeah, I don't know.
Effect, those are the things you own. That's
Okay,
your
so that's
property.
their word for, okay,
That's
gotcha.
their property,
So
all their effects.
persons, houses, papers, and effects.
And all your personal property. Let's go back to understand, we talked earlier about to understand the Constitution, you have to understand the Declaration. We go back to the Declaration, that is the result of the Declaration's grievance against writs of assistance. Now, writs of assistance, really interesting stuff. See, the British were into monopolies, and the British wanted to tax the dickens out of you, so you're not allowed free market competition. The British will send you sugar. Well, I can get sugar out of a different place for 1/3 the price. No, you will buy our sugar. And so there was a Sugar Act and the Molasses Act and all this other stuff that said you don't get to compete. You will buy what we send you at the prices we give you. Well, that's where black market smuggling went up. And that's where a lot of these guys would go up to Canada and get it and come back and sell it in the United States, competitive market, free market. Anywhere you have a monopoly, it's because the government's involved. We think the government busts monopolies. No, the government creates monopolies. Free market busts monopolies.
right.
And so
Yeah, government protects monopolies.
that's right. The government protects monopolies by eliminating competition. So what happened was you had all these Americans who were in violation of British laws. Well, I'm sorry, that violates the laws of nature. You can't tell a raccoon you can only get food from this tree. If a raccoon wants the food out of this tree, you're going to go wherever and get the best food.
Yeah.
So this monopoly stuff violates the law of nature. You got competition all over nature. You know, any animal will go where it wants. Squirrels go to whatever trees have the best amount of nuts for them. So the British have now made a lot of Americans into criminals by this black market stuff. So how do you punish that? Well, we're going to go search your house and see if you've got some illegal sugar in there. You don't have the right king's seal on your sugar or your molasses or your butter or whatever it is. And so the way they did that was with writs of assistance. So the British come knocking at your door. They say, I have a judicially issued warrant here to search your house. Well, what are you searching for? Well, we don't know, but we're going to search your house. So they take the judicial warrant, they go in and they look and they look and they look, and finally, under the fourth bedroom, below the third pillow, they find a cube of sugar. They then fill out the warrant and say, we're searching for illegal sugar in your house. They then arrest you and haul you off. Now, the Founding Fathers said, wait a minute, you're making us condemn ourselves. You're coming into our homes looking to find something wrong. You don't know that anything's wrong, but you think there might be something wrong. And so you're coming into our homes, you're searching our persons, our houses, our papers, and our effects, trying to find something wrong. We're not going to have that. We're going to tell you, and read it again. Read what they say.
All right, so the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures.
Keep
Shall
going.
not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized.
So you don't get an open warrant to come in and search.
Yeah.
You have to have probable cause. There has to be, you have to have pretty compelling belief that there's something illegal there, and you have to specifically say what you're looking for. So when that British guy knocks up, he says, you know, 24 of your neighbors have testified that you have illegal sugar here, and I know where it is. It's in that closet that you have down in the hallway. And unless it's something like that, you can't. Now, let's understand the writs of assistance, what they're doing. Your home is your gift from God. That's why we have the Third Amendment to protect the privacy of the home. You are the head of the castle, not the government. IRS knocks at your door and says, we're here to do an audit of you. What are you going to audit? I don't know. Bring out the last 3 years of your check stubs. We'll go through till we find something wrong. Once we find something wrong, we're going to nail you with a penalty.
You know, that just doesn't sound like particularly describing.
That sounds like a writ of assistance.
That sounds like the old anything and everything. We don't even know what we're looking for, but we're going to find something.
The way the Founding Fathers would have done that is, IRS agent, great. You're welcome to come search my check stubs just as soon as you bring me a judicially issued warrant specifically listing the check stubs you want to see.
Yeah.
But see, we don't know that history, so we let all sorts of audits take place without saying, whoa, you don't have a right to come into my home. That's not your jurisdiction, is my home.
Yeah.
And so that's why the Fourth Amendment is so interesting, because it is persons, houses, papers, and effects. Anything I own, all my effects, you know, whatever I've got put in the garage, whatever I got in the storage barn out back, whatever I've got a farm down here with 3 barns on it, and that's my effects. You can't get into it without specific delineation of what you're looking for and probable cause that I have what you think is illegal.
It's kind of a slippery slope, right? We've allowed this to get that bad because we didn't know about this, and so we thought, well, yeah, I guess they have to verify people's income and whatnot, and now
but
years
it's the fiction
later,
of the law. Is the fiction?
Yeah, that's right. It's that fiction you talked about earlier.
Yeah.
So now we think, well, they absolutely have the right to come in
have the right to
and
come in.
identify all those things, but they really don't. But
If you
we've
know the
forgotten what this
Constitution,
says.
see, this is
Yeah.
where you assert the Constitution. You say, IRS, you're welcome to come back as soon as you bring with you a judicially issued search warrant specifically detailing the things to be found upon probable cause.
Yeah.
And when you get that, you're welcome to come into my business, my home. See, that's what the Founding Fathers would have instantly done. So that's the Fourth Amendment.
Man, there's so much that we could dive into with each and every
is.
one of these. We're scratching the surface. I mean, we're
Right.
getting to as many as we can. Again, like we said earlier, it's the quick start guy. We want to just give people a chance to get this thing plugged in and get it working again. What about the Fifth Amendment? Before we get out of this and come back on the amendment process.
Fifth Amendment is the right of self-incrimination. By the way the audits happen now, they require you to incriminate yourself.
Yeah, that's
you have
true.
to provide the evidence that
That's
they're going.
true.
But the Fifth Amendment says you can't do self-incrimination. See, the due process clauses from Fourth through Eighth Amendment are designed to make the government prove that you're guilty against everything you can do otherwise. You do not have to cooperate with the government. They can be compelled, they can bring witnesses, but you can compel witnesses to come in your favor. You have every right to make it as hard as you can for the government to prove you're guilty of something. And so that's what the due process is, because they've got the weight of government and all the attorneys, and they keep printing money, and they don't run out of money.
Right,
You've
right.
got the right to make, so if they come to audit you, now we're guilty of self-incrimination. Well, that's the Fifth Amendment. But also in the Fifth Amendment is a takings clause that says government cannot take any property without compensation. Now, how does government take property? Well, there's several ways it can do it. It can do it through eminent domain. the Supreme Court changed that from public use to public purpose.
Yeah.
And public use made it very hard for a government to take property. Public purpose makes it very easy.
That's a great example of the Constitution being modified by the court
courts.
without we the people actually being
We
the
the
ones to
people
do it.
didn't do
Yeah.
it. But James Madison talked about other ways the government takes your property and doesn't compensate. Now, you gave the example of that yellow-cheeked warbler. You know,
Right,
that was
right.
And I got personal experience. We had a ranch in Central Texas down where all this happened, and for 7 years the federal government told us we could not cut cedars on our ranch because there might be a golden-cheeked warbler out there somewhere.
Really? I didn't know that it personally
Personally
impacted you guys.
And in that part of the country, if you can't stay ahead of cedars, you will lose your ranch. It will take over. They grow like weeds. Each cedar drinks about 40 gallons of water a day. They dry out the land. So we couldn't do it. And you know, these are environmental folks they're very definitely pro-evolution. And I say, well, what happened to survival of the fittest? And by the way, if that yellow-cheeked warbler doesn't have the sense to fly out of a tree that's being cut down, it needs to be extinct. You know, if it does.
Exactly.
But that's another argument. But nonetheless, they basically ruined our ranch because we lost control of it. We couldn't keep our cattle grazing because now all the property, we couldn't cut down cedars. And so what compensation did we get? Absolutely none. Well, government just took our property. They took it over as if it was theirs, told us what we couldn't do on our property. See, this is what James Madison talks about. This is not a new issue of government. You go to James Madison, and he says, government is instituted to protect property. Now, we've looked at that in several ways. He said, your conscience is property, other things, but he continues. He says, this being the end of government, that alone is a just government which impartially secures to every man whatever is his own. Now, Thomas Jefferson said that includes your income. If you expend your time, your sweat, your blood, your tears for income, that's your property. Government should protect your property, not take it from you.
Not take it and give it to others.
That's right. So they held that. He continues, he says, it's not a just government, nor is property secure under it, where arbitrary restrictions deny to part of its citizens that free use of their faculties. We're talking about zoning use now. He says the government comes in and tells you what you can and can't do with your property. Is an American Heritage Site. No, it's part of the River Act. No, it's a swampland.
Yeah.
And so they're coming in now and zoning, and a lot of churches are finding this, that they're being told that there's a church in Portland, 500 people go to church there, a great church, it's a growing church. Portland came in and says, no, we don't like 500 people going to church. We've zoned it for only 80 people, and that's all you can have. Wait a minute, it's our property. Yeah, I know, but you're using our property, and we don't want more than 80 people on our property. So that is a violation of inalienable rights.
Yeah.
And then he says, or where the property which a man has in his personal safety and personal liberty is violated by arbitrary seizures of one class of citizens for the service of the rest.
Oh, wow.
That is the Kelo decision.
Yeah.
And so the Founding Fathers, again, are very explicit on what government is and is not to do. And the Fifth Amendment, if they take your property through zoning regulations that you can no longer use it, if they take it by saying you got a yellow-cheeked warbler out there and you can't use your own property, they've got to compensate you for that. But that doesn't happen because we don't know what that Fifth Amendment means anymore. But the founders, again, were very expressive.
Well, even just the quotes themselves. I mean, obviously, just reading the Constitution, you'll realize you should be compensated when that property's taken. But the way they describe it, I mean, to a T, that's exactly what's being violated today. Those
right.
are excellent quotes. So if we'll study that, again, get back into the minds of the Founding Fathers, then when we go vote for a congressman, we ought to ask them, how do you feel about the Endangered Species Act and how it's being used to take people's property? And at many other levels, but using these quotes, using the Constitution itself to make decisions about who we're going to elect, who we're going to put in office, that will turn this thing around. But this is all part of that. We got to think long term. It's all about applying these principles. Comes back to that idea of we got to read and study, we got to know it, then we'll be able to defend and assert that. So when we come back in our next section, we're going to actually get into amendments. What can we do to make sure that the Constitution and the original intent is actually being enforced in our country? So in Section 10, we'll check out the amendment process here on Constitutional Live.